So I thought today I'd start off by addressing some terminology that's used very regularly in the teaching, and it's used very specifically. The terminology is, let's say, person and human being and doer and non-doer. And there are a difference between these words. They have different meanings as used in the context of this teaching. And it can be a bit confusing because other teachings and maybe even in everyday use, those words either don't exist, like the doer doesn't really exist in the English language, or they're used in a different context. So you would hear me often referring to we have a false idea of who we are. We have an idea that we are a separate, independent entity in complete control of everything that we think, say, feel, and do. So in other words, we believe that we are a separate, independent doer. So that means we have an idea of ourselves as being something independent and isolated from life, separate from life, unaffected, not connected to, separate. Right? That's the image that we hold about ourselves. The concepts say that actually the person is not a separate, independent entity, but it says we are the person. So what is it really saying? It's saying that there is a person. The idea we have of ourselves as a person is being a separate, independent entity. But rather, the person is not a separate, independent entity. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a person here. If we say the person isn't the doer, it doesn't mean that there isn't a person. It just means that the person is not separate and independent from, in and of itself. So if you have a radio-controlled car, for example, you do have a radio-controlled car, but it isn't a separate, independent entity. It's connected to the mechanism that controls it. So we don't then say the car doesn't exist. The car exists, but it isn't a separate, independent entity. The car exists, the person exists, but they are connected to something bigger. They are an expression of something larger. You could say, use the analogy that's often used, a wave in the ocean. The wave is not separate from the ocean. So the wave is not a separate, independent entity. But the wave exists as a distinct form of the ocean. So for us to say that, because the wave is not a separate, independent entity, the wave doesn't exist, is to only assess it from one perspective. So if we understand that the whole ocean is made of water and the wave is also made of water, we can say all there is water. But to overlook the fact that the water manifests in the form of a wave and say, because all there is water, there is no wave, is to be caught up in a concept about the ocean and all parts of the ocean simply being water. Now, that doesn't mean that the concept that the ocean and the wave is water is inaccurate, but if we hold on to it in our mind too strongly, it can prevent us from seeing what's actually there, which means the ocean in the form of a wave. And so this is a very important distinction in the teaching, because often we have the person going around saying there is no person. Whereas what would be a more accurate thing to say is there is a person, but I am not a separate independent entity, and therefore whatever I do, whatever happens through me, whatever acts and actions happen, I can't claim as being my own. Because when we look at the mechanics, what the point of pointing out that we are not a separate, independent doer means that we are connected to life. We've been spawned from life, designed by life, and never separate from life. And so life is essentially living through us in each moment. Life is moving through us, living us. And so there is a person, there is a Roger, but I'm part of life. So the false idea is that there is a person that is independent and in control of everything that happens. That's the false idea. The idea there is a person that is not in control, or not the doer, is an accurate assessment of things. And so not the doer doesn't mean that I don't do things in the sense of functioning. Very clearly, functioning is always happening through us. I do the ironing. I do the dishes. I take a shower. I make the bed. I drive the car. So all of these things are definitely happening. And on one level we can say, well, I did that. I broke the glass accidentally. I painted the picture. But when I say my idea of myself, with the understanding that I'm not a separate doer, means I, the instrument through which life is functioning. And so when I say you, I'm seeing you as an instrument through which life is functioning. And so you and I are distinct on one level and connected on another level. Distinct in that there are very clearly different expressions of life. And in this daily life experience, this particular manifestation, the story of life is actually a story of inter-human relationship. And even once the oneness of life is recognized, the experience on a particular level, actually on the practical level, is still one of living as this person, interacting with other people, with the sense that I am this person and not the other person. Enjoying the pleasure that life delivers and enduring the pain that life delivers. So why is this distinction important? Before coming to this teaching, I actually had various realizations that had led to the conclusion that there is nobody here. that there is no person. To be honest, when I was first listening to Ramesh, I was listening to him and hearing this teaching and saying, yes, this teaching is just the first step to this much deeper realization that there is nobody here, that there is no person. So having gone to him with that realization already having happened, that there is no one here, there is just the spontaneous arising of this present moment experience with a whole lot of different, you could say, layers of experience: visual, sound, taste, touch, thought, emotions, all choreographed in order for there to be the appearance or the sense of a person, but in fact it's just all experience. There is no person. And so when I was listening to Ramesh talking about non-doership, and that there is a person, but you're not the doer, I said, oh, that's just the first step to eventually having an implication that if there's a person who's not the doer, then eventually the implication is, well, there is no person. And it was only after some time of listening, and after having listened, my experience becoming much more integrated, because the relationship that there was between Ramesh and I was one of reintegrating after essentially what you could call non-dual awakenings. And the integration back into daily living in a way moves us past those non-dual awakenings, at least experientially. And as my experience started to change back to one of living more and more as a person, which really meant just acknowledging that the person was here, because even during those phases of having this non-dual awareness forefront, present at the front of the experience, you could say, where the person was always related to as a parent. The person was still there. It was just that the process had moved us away from having our attention on the person, had moved us to a point of almost dismissing essentially the wave as being there, and moving the attention simply on the water, which in practical terms meant the equivalent would be walking down a street, seeing a whole lot of houses and just seeing them as bricks rather than the specific form that the bricks had been placed in. And for a while that seems like that's having transcended the relative, transcended what is referred to as the illusion. And so living in that state can be mistaken as being living in a state of knowing the truth or knowing reality. And little did I realize, until having met Ramesh, that that was actually a form of, you could say, delusion, a form of a concept that is very useful, having done its job, and then being held on to so tightly that the full picture isn't able to actually be acknowledged as being what it is, which means being able to see a house and call it a house and relate to it as a house and go up to the door and open the door and walk through the door, which was always happening, even when the house was being seen only as, well, bricks. You can go down to even smaller substance and say atoms, where you understand theoretically, actually it's not even bricks, there's atoms, and then you can go down to quantum mechanics and understand theoretically how even matter isn't really there. And so that deep theoretical understanding can actually change the experience. You can start looking at matter, and if there's a deep understanding that the matter is actually the outward expression of a very different inward movement, you can start relating to the matter very differently and sort of experience it. You might almost think that your hand can move through the matter because it's not really solid. Because the understanding that it's quantum is deep. You really understand that side of the coin. But the fact is that your hand can't go through it. And even if you think you're seeing on a quantum level, you're not. So these non-dual awakenings where we awaken to a oneness, understanding that everything is arising in consciousness, doesn't change the fact that the physical is still, in practical terms, there and very much a valid part of the manifestation. We can't separate it. We can in our head. We can conceptually create a distinction and say something is real and something else is unreal. But they actually coexist together, which means the whole thing in its entirety as it presents is real. So the relative is as real as the absolute. And we make a big mistake if we create a conceptual distinction between the relative and the absolute, which actually doesn't exist in reality. There is no distinction between the relative and the absolute. We can only come to understand them as two in our head, and that's useful to maybe understand something that we didn't understand before. But in actuality, they're not two. And so if we then create this conceptual distinction in order to understand, and then it doesn't get put back together again, and we go around saying, well, that is just apparent. And this word apparent is the word that is appropriate when the awakening happens. If that's your particular path, this particular sort of awakening is not essential. It will happen if you go through certain teachings. And other teachings will bring about the required changes in a different way. So this is what I mean when I say we're not looking for a oneness experience. What we're looking for is peace of mind. And some teachings bring about peace of mind through a particular methodology that often include various oneness experiences, oneness states. And because that's very profound, because it's not how we have experienced life before, and because we've been told over and over that life is actually all one, that the universe is one, all Brahman. Then when that shift happens, understandably there is the conclusion drawn, this is it, this is what we're looking for, this is enlightenment, this is reality presenting itself, the oneness. And we can become convinced that what we're looking for is a oneness experience, a state. And it can, when I mean experience, I'm not using the word experience as it's sometimes used as subject-object relationship and part of illusion and ignorance. I'm talking about experience as either an experience of duality or an experience of oneness. So I mean experiences, meaning when life presents, in whatever form, what presents is experienced, which doesn't imply necessarily a separate experiencer. It can be just experiencing. And that's the case in a oneness experience. So, when those shifts happen, the oneness shifts, it's appropriate for a while for that vision, that perspective to ground in, for us to start calling everything apparent. There is an apparent human. There is apparently good and bad. There is apparently this, it's all apparent. Because what we're seeing is what is changing. And so what brought about that shift is an emphasis onto that which is unchanging. A teaching that kept pointing and reminding that what we are is that which is unchanging, that which is ever present. And even that is a concept and not the truth. That statement, what we are is that which is unchanging and ever present, is a concept that helps us, brings about change. And so for a while, everything that is seen is looked at as just the relative, which is coming and going. And so we've now created this distinction in our head, the absolute and then the relative. And the relative is usually held as, well, it's there, but it's not really real. Whereas the absolute is real. So bringing it together would then mean we exclaim that the relative is real, the absolute is real, with the same conviction for both. So this apparent business falls away. And in fact, we then can even admit that the absolute is not something that is known. There have been various awakenings, but they haven't really been awakenings of the absolute. They've been awakenings to what has been called the absolute in a teaching. And because it's been called the absolute and pointed at, then there are various shifts and awakenings, but that's not really absolute. So we might think we're looking for a oneness experience. And when those oneness experiences happen, we think, here we go, this is it. Now I'm touching onto something real. What we're looking for in practical terms is the end of suffering, peace of mind. And if we become convinced that we're looking for oneness, meaning to experience life as a oneness experience, to continually be aware of certain aspects of the momentary life experience and not lose touch of those. In fact, essentially, just to keep it simple, for there to always be a sense of oneness, an experiential sense of oneness. Then we lose track of the fact that actually all I'm looking for is the end of suffering, the end of feeling attacked when the other person doesn't do what I would like, the end of blaming the other person for not having done what I would like, the end of feeling shame and second guessing yourself when the other doesn't appreciate you or do what you would like, and then we wonder, why did that happen? Did I do something wrong? The end of pride, the end of worry and anxiety, the end of expectation and resisting because of the expectations that we have. When those things start falling away because the process does what it's meant to do in its magical way, that's what really is valuable. That's what we really say thank you for when it happens. When we stop finding ourselves resisting life and feeling threatened and attacked by life. When the other isn't seen as a competitor or an enemy. Because what they do or don't do doesn't actually hurt us at our core.
If I could go back to the terminology discussion you were having, could you help me get my head around this concept of experiencing rather than an experiencer experiencing an experience? In the sense that what's happening here, the images are falling in Anil's retina, and there are other images falling in Roger's retina, and Roger's synapses are firing, and that's an experience. And so are Anil's synapses firing, and so it seems to me Roger's having an experience and Anil's having an experience, and I'm trying to wrap my head around what does just experiencing happening really mean?
Yeah. Well, we'll go into it, because I've sort of brought this topic up. It's been sort of the topic of the last couple of days. But those listening and you hear who know the teachings, know it's actually not really the main point of the teachings, because the teachings are saying there is a person, and the person is experiencing life. So the perspective of knowing life from the point of view of a person isn't actually the problem. In fact, once the integration that I spoke about happens, after the various realizations and changes in the qualitative nature of the personal consciousness experience, such that it can feel very impersonal. When after that there's an integration, and the integration basically brings us back to living as the person who is living in a world and experiencing things outside of them. Right? So in this teaching, that's not the problem. However, why we can talk about life as a singularity and go through various exercises that can bring about a sense that there is actually all just experience happening, and that Roger and Anil, from the point of view when there is just experiencing happening, is registered as not the subject but another object in the experience. there are those exercises we can do to bring about that shift. Really the only significance in that is, as far as I would say now, is the significance is that it can aid us in undoing some of the deeply ingrained beliefs that lead to suffering. Because it gives us a different perspective on life. It allows us to question everything that we've assumed to be accurate, because we've always seen life a certain way. And so when it's seen a different way, then it's just another way of life showing us, are you sure that the things you think you know, you absolutely know? It's a way of bringing us to see life in a way that we can relate to things that are changing, and see that things are changing. It is a shift that can allow us to see from a perspective that can see the body as a mechanical instrument moving. That speaking is just happening.
So I can probably, I mean, if you talk about Anil is swimming or Anil is walking, I can sort of rationalize that as, you know, Anil is not the doer, it's just happening through him. But in the case of experience, there isn't any doership issue, at least in my mind. So it does seem to be, you know, Anil's sort of personal experience and Roger's personal experience of this moment, rather than experiencing happening, which is dissimilar from walking happening and swimming happening, because there I can rationalize the concepts you present.
Right. Okay. So I see where you're coming from, and I agree. What you're saying is right. Is that there is a separate. Well, let's not use the word separate. There is an experiencer in life. So when I talk about experiencing without an experiencer, what you're saying, and rightly so, is, hang on, but there is an experiencer in life, and that experiencer is Anil. And so when you talk about experiencing, meaning the absence of an experiencer, that doesn't compute, right? So, and I agree. Now, there'll be people that will be at a particular way of seeing life, and they'll go, no, there isn't. You see, you're wrong, Roger. There isn't experiencer. There is just experiencing, and in the experiencing, it seems like there is an experiencer. So the experiencing has been created to create the impression that there is an experiencer, and that's the illusion, right? And when the experience shifts to reveal that there is just experiencing, then you'll know that there is no experiencer, right? So that's what someone would say to my comment and your comment, that there is an experiencer. And in a way, they're all right, because it's a matter of perspective.
Yes, since you were doing terminology, I was just trying to resolve that in my head.
Yeah. So
it may not be important, as you were saying, really, to eliminate suffering. It's just another concept that we're playing with, but I just thought...
No, I think it's very valid, and we should do it, because this is where, this teaching is sliding in to take a position of bringing an integration. to the various non-dual awakenings. So this topic, although nuanced, is particularly important for those that are on a path where the world is being pointed out as illusory, and where the aim of that part of the phase is for there to be an awakening to this oneness. And so this teaching is fitting in and essentially taking over at some point and saying, okay, that's happened, and it's very useful that that's happened, but now let's introduce some new concepts that may loosen up the concepts that more than likely have become very strong beliefs and are creating a stagnation. So talking about what you're talking about, the nuanced difference is important. So if there is an experiencer, let's work on the basis that because that's one way of seeing life, right? That there is Roger and Anil, and the light of objects is coming into our eyes, and then all of the processes are happening, and essentially the image is projected into our mind, and we have an experience of an external world. Which is
that experience that Roger just experienced of this present moment is distinct from that experienced in Anil.
And in Anil, on following the model, the conceptual model about what life is, that says there is a Roger in an objective world and then Anil as
two waves in the ocean. Yes.
Yeah. And so then you're quite correct, is that we'd say your experience is arising within Anil's consciousness, and my experience is arising in Roger's consciousness, because we're working on the model that says there's an objective world, and light is bouncing off these objects, being received by Roger, processed by the brain, and then the image is projected into the mind. Why this is useful? So a lot of the non-dual Advaita doesn't say that. It doesn't talk about two people in an objective world. It says there is no objective world. That what appears like an objective world is an arising in the consciousness of Source, a dream, an imagination. And what Source is consciousness, the consciousness of God, you could say, universal consciousness. And you and I and what seems like the objective world is simply a momentary appearance, like a night dream that we have, where running on the basis that there is a Roger and an Anil, going back to that model, when we have a night dream, a whole world spontaneously arises in our personal consciousness. It appears to be real and objective. It appears to be independent. And as soon as the dreamer wakes up, that world collapses. So that analogy is useful to help demonstrate what top-down Advaita is saying. It's saying actually there is no objective world, there is only a subjective appearance, and that subjective appearance is designed to appear like an objective reality. Right? And we don't know that that is not right. Because if that was the case, what it would be experienced as is exactly what we experience here. We know this because when a night dream happens, which is not an objective world, it's experienced from within the dream, within the night dream, as an objective reality. And then it collapses, and we wake up and we realize, wow, that thing, it was so convincing, and yet it was all just apparent. And so Advaita is saying this is that. This is a dream in the mind of God, and there is no Anil, and there is no Roger, and there is no couch and tree, because as soon as we look at them like that, as if there is an Anil and a Roger and a couch and a tree, we lose sight of the fact that there is actually an imagination happening. And we start looking at the actuality of it, or we start looking at the content, and can get hypnotized into being convinced that the content is a representation of truth. So that's what Advaita is trying to bring us away from. And it is very available for an experience to happen. A shift, you could say, in experience, because it's fair to say that our experience, by and large, is an experience of a person in a world, an experiencer aware of external objects. That, I think it's fair to say, is the general perspective from which life is seen from the average person on the street. And it is very possible for the experience that is had to change radically, such that within the experience there is the sense that there is no experiencer and there is just experiencing. Now, when that happens, meaning the experience changes, that's when people will start making statements like, oh, there is no experiencer, there is just experiencing. If we get a little bit critical with this, use a bit of critical thinking on it, because the experience has changed such that the experience says there is no experiencer, doesn't mean there is no experiencer. It just means the experience has changed such that the experience doesn't contain the sense of an experiencer.
Is that how, if I may ask you, how you feel, I mean, when you experience a moment, because when I experience this moment, the feeling that, or the sense that I have is that, this is my experience. I mean, I'm not sure everyone's seeing it the way I am.
Yeah.
But when you experience this moment, is your sense that it's an experience happening for you?
I have what you could say is a simultaneous, a mix of both, where I almost, it seems like at will, because the body-mind has been shaped this way, so it isn't my doing, but it seems at will, the way the experience is experienced can change from one end of the spectrum to the other end of the spectrum, and most often it is experienced where it's a hybrid of the two. Right? But I spent many years on experiencing life from the perspective of the spectrum where there was just experiencing, no experiencer, which I thought was liberation and enlightenment, to be living life without the sense of an experiencer. And you could say that is a oneness experience. And thankfully, really thankfully, so this was back in early 2000s, 2001 to 2004-05. And thankfully, when I went to meet Ramesh from the very beginning, of meeting Ramesh, he started fixing that, right? Correcting what had happened, which correcting doesn't mean it was an error, but it needed to be further refined. So let's go back to this notion that the experience can change such that there isn't, or within the experience, there is no sense of an experiencer. There is no sense of an object experienced. There is just experiencing, which I guess is very hard for us to imagine if it's not our experience, exactly. Not the experience that's happening.
But this is one you have had. So.
Yes, but I have to say it again. It's not necessarily as significant as.
I'm just curious as to whether, whether Ramesh felt experiencing happening and whether you feel that.
So.
So to speak, experience that.
Well, okay, but so, but then that implies that that's what it's all about.
No.
So Ramesh had said on the record, now whether it's true or whether it was for the sake of teaching, he said he never had a oneness experience.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, I'm not sure I take that statement as truth. Right? What I do run with is that it changes. It's meant to change. Life is meant to move us well beyond that to experience of life where we're experiencing life as the experiencer again. Meaning we come back to know ourselves as the person experiencing the orange that is on the table. And that the orange and the table are not inside me.
I think it's like someone said, right? You start off thinking trees are trees and mountains are mountains, and then you get this revelation that it's all one.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you really figure it out, it's back to them being trees and mountains.
Exactly. Yeah. So let's look at why this oneness experience, when it happens, which tells us that there is no experiencer, one doesn't prove that there is no experiencer. We have to, along the way, one of the biggest insights we have is not to take the relative as absolute, not to draw conclusions in an absolute sense from that which is relative. So a great example of something that's relative is our thought, our thinking. So our thinking will draw a conclusion, but one of the big insights we have is understand that your thought and the conclusion is relative. So don't mistake that as something absolute. Understand that from another perspective it could be different. With more information you could draw a different conclusion. And understand that the brain is limited, the amount of information it has is limited, and it will always be limited. So we can never produce an absolute conclusion. Experience is very, very limited. Even the experience that we call reality, because a certain lens seems to have fallen away, which is what changes the quality of the experience. Actually, it's a completely new experience. It isn't that a lens has fallen away and now reality is revealed. It's just a new experience that is different to the previous experience. And when we realize that it isn't that a lens has fallen away and now we see reality. What's happened is the experience as it's created in this moment is created differently to the experience that was created in the previous moment. It's still an experience. It's still completely relative, completely changing. And we make a big mistake when we take what the experience is telling us what the experience is informing us, and say, oh, now I know absolutely that there is no person, because the experience doesn't include the sense of a person in the same way as the early experience did. It's just an experience. You can't prove anything from that. And big error that gets made. So, are you happy to keep going on this exploration? Because I think for the sake of recording it, it's an important topic. The assumption when we come through various paths, through various methodologies, when this shift happens and the sense of an experiencer falls away, the assumption is this is reality, and therefore everything that was in the teachings that brought this about is absolute truth, instead of relating to what was put forward as a methodology to bring about that change, right? And the teachings that brought about the change referred to life one way, essentially, using one conceptual model. The conceptual model that says everything is arising inside the consciousness of Source, the one consciousness. So it's saying there is no Roger's experience of life and Anil's experience of life. It might appear like Roger has an experience and Anil has an experience, but actually it's all happening in the one source.
Yeah, so to go with your wave example, so the Roger wave has an experience which is a wavelet on the Roger wave, and Anil has an experience which is a wavelet on the Anil wave, but it's still, those wavelets are still ocean.
Yes.
So from that point of view, I could sort of wrap my head around it, but that wavelet is still on Anil's wave, so I sort of feel possessive about it.
Yeah. So when this shift of experience happens, right? When this changed experience happens, what becomes pronounced in that experience is the oceanness, and in a sense, the waveness almost dissipates. It doesn't, it's still there, but it's so not what the emphasis in the experience is that it seems insignificant. So that changed experience emphasizes the oceanness. And the assumption is that now I know the consciousness of God. I am the consciousness of God in which the whole experience is arising. Because, as I said, the teachings only put forward that model. But what about the model that we talked about, that said, yes, we acknowledge that the model that says it's all arising in the one source would be experienced like this, like we experience it. So we can't discount that model at all. But what about if that oneness experience can be explained using a different model? In other words, what if the oneness experience doesn't confirm that model A that says it's all happening in God? What if it doesn't absolutely confirm that? What if we can look at another model that is also supported by the fact that this oneness experience can happen? And if that second model isn't introduced into the minds of the person who is having this oneness experience, and they continue to assume that the oneness experience is proof of various things, then that's when a stagnation can happen. So going back to what you were talking about an objective Anil and an objective Roger in a world, seeing the external world, the objective external world, and experiencing it. And then when we look at how do we experience, if that's what this actually is, if this actually is an objective reality, how do we experience the external world? We experience it by light bouncing off the objects, by sound waves bouncing off the objects, and being received by the instrument. And let's just use the sight component of the experience. The light is received by the lenses of the eyes in an upside down or inverted fashion. That is then turned into electromagnetic signals and processed by the brain, flipped the right way round, and then projected onto consciousness. The consciousness in this model, it would be the consciousness of the individual. And so this experience that we're having, the experience that every human is having at any point in time, assuming that that is the actual model that accounts for reality, the experience that we're having, that we know as an experience of the world outside of us, is always arising inside of our consciousness. It's never, we never know the external world. We only know an image of the external world inside our consciousness. But that image in our consciousness correlates perfectly to the, or not perfectly, but correlates directly to the external world, because it's received from input in the form of light and sound waves from the external world. So it arises in, we only know the image, but the image is essentially, it's a replica of the external world. So when we move using the image, we're actually moving in the external world. So the point here is that because the experience doesn't feel like an experience arising in our personal consciousness, because it appears like an external world, we don't relate to it as an image arising in our consciousness. But if it's an image arising in our consciousness, isn't it possible for a shift to happen because of certain prompts? Let's say prompts that are pointing out that what you are is the awareness, not the imagery. And as those prompts come in and they create certain thinking, isn't it possible that something changes in the brain whereby the experience, which has always been an experience arising in the personal consciousness, then changes and takes on a completely different feel to it? So essentially, the brain is not relating to the external world in the way it always has as we've grown up, because certain prompts, spiritual teachings have come in, brought about change, and now the brain is relating to is producing the image in a different way. It's taking a different standpoint, meaning the consciousness is now viewing the image of the world from a different perspective. And so then it makes complete sense to me that the oneness experience, where there is the sense that, oh, I am not the body, but I am the awareness that is aware of the whole image. It makes complete sense to me that that can very easily be the experience created by a person in an objective world, an objective person in an objective world. And the truth of the matter is, as far as I've seen, with a very keen interest on knowing which one is it, which of the two models is the one that accurately describes reality. The conclusion I came to is we won't know. We can't know. What we can know is that it's all an experience arising in consciousness. That we can come to experience, and even if we don't experience it, we can come to understand it through a thought experiment, various thought experiments, it says, yes, of course, all of the light is coming into the instrument, and then the instrument is creating projecting that into consciousness. So what we're aware of is the consciousness experience. So even if the experience doesn't change such that there is this oneness, we can still become familiar with this as a momentary experience. A momentary experience, even when it's experienced from the perspective of a experiencer. So even when it's an experience from the point of an experiencer, we can get a sense that it is all a single experience. The experience, you could say, arising in my personal consciousness. So what is the significance of that when it relates to peace of mind? Because after all, as we've always said, what we're really looking for is peace of mind in daily living. And what this exploration shows us is that whatever is happening here is a creation. Whatever we experience is a creation. Either a creation in the mind of an omniscient universal God, or the creation in the mind of a person, or there are many different models that fit in between those two. This could be a virtual world created by a civilization that is more advanced than the civilization we know within this virtual world, which would be sort of akin to the explanation that it's all an arising in the consciousness of God. But if we just take the two that we've been talking about, the two models, the important factor is that it is a creation, and what happens in the creation is a result of either God that has brought the creation into existence, or the result of a complex organism, the person, functioning the way that it's designed to function, because we didn't design how the eyes pick up the light. We didn't design the fact that that then gets projected onto a mind, and we definitely didn't design the mind. So we are actually what we know ourselves as the person is the experience in the mind of the person. And so the thinking of the person is all part of the functioning of that complex instrument, having the momentary experience. So looking at it this way, we start to see, okay, I'm not the doer in the sense there isn't an entity that is controlling how the experience turns out. There is a human being in a world, let's say an objective human being in an objective world, designed by life. So the world means life. The human being is not separate from life. Nothing is separate from life. The ocean isn't separate from life. The trees and the plants and all the other people, all of that is life. And we're functioning according to how life has designed us. And even if we take the other model, where it's all an arising in God's mind, and we are characters that are part of that creation, part of the movie, you could say, part of the story of life in God's mind, very clearly then we see I'm not the doer, I am being lived by God, essentially. So these words are coming out because they're part of the momentary creation in the universal God. And so I don't need to worry about what comes out, because I know that what comes out is what's destined to come out, what was created by God, not by me. So in both cases, we get to see the non-doership of things. And even if this is a creation in the mind of God, when we look at the creation, it's a creation that is impeccably one of cause and effect, time and space. It's always presenting in such a way that A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D. And so even holding that this is a creation in the mind of God, we can't ignore the causality of it. We can't ignore the manifest, the appearance, we can't ignore things on that level, which we often do, as I spoke about at the beginning of the talk. We often do when we become obsessed with the fact it's all just an arising in the consciousness of God. Then we're not interested in what is arising, and we're only seeing the consciousness, the background. And then that means we're not looking at the actual story and taking note of the story. And when we do come back to that, we see, oh wow, this is a story of cause and effect, of time and space, of a person living in a world. So even if it's ultimately not an objectively real world, who cares? You still have to live as if you are a person and as if the world is real, not because you have to pretend that way, because the creation of God, if we take that model, has created this to be exactly that world, a world of time and space, a world of form, a world of people, a world of interhuman relationships. And even after all of these realizations, it continues. The liberated person still has to turn on the kettle in order to get hot water. Meaning the rules of cause and effect don't suddenly stop applying because various things have been seen past. So if that's the case, we go, oh, so the cause and effect aspect isn't just illusion. It isn't there because someone is not seeing clearly. Because after the various seeings, life continues to unfold according to cause and effect. So then we can forget about which model it is. It's not relevant anymore which model it is, whether it's an objective reality or an appearance arising in the consciousness of God. For a long time we think, well, that's the whole point, is to know truth, to know reality. Which one is it? And often it's said we start off believing that it is an objective reality, which is an error, and then we realize it's not an objective reality, it's all an arising in consciousness. And I say that's not the aim, that's not the end game. The point is that coming to realize that it is an arising in consciousness, either God's or the personal consciousness, allows us to then come back and say, yes, but what is arising is a story of cause and effect, a story of being a person living in a world where, you know, if someone hits you on a piece of wood after liberation, it doesn't go through you because you now realize that this is all apparent. It knocks you out. And so we have to get real again and stop living in a fantasy world that keeps going around saying, oh, it's all unreal, it's all apparent. That's why I say sometimes I'd like to get a bamboo stick and start whacking someone who is insistent on that side only. That'll get them very quickly to the practical and go, oh, I can't deny the pain. I can't deny that aspect of the creation. And if I do, I'm ignoring a whole half, thinking I'm seeing the whole. And so, from this perspective of just treating it as it presents, which is a life of causality, a life of matter, a life of person. What is the real error? What's the real illusion? And I'd say the real illusion is when the human being, the person, is programmed by life with the belief that they are a separate, independent doer in control of everything that happens through them. That error, that illusion, is the basis on which suffering arises. And when that illusion, to me, that is an illusion. So in whichever model it is, the belief that I am a separate, independent entity. So even in the objective reality model, we're not, just because there's an objective human doesn't make us a separate, independent human. It makes us an expression of the objective world. And the explanation is that the sperm and egg come together, it starts to grow, and all of that is a movement of life. So the human has never separated from life. And if we look at the explanation that's normally given, we function according to our genes and up-to-date conditioning, which are factors in the objective world or in the mind of God that have been put in place, and they are what drive us to function the way that we function. And in both models, we didn't control those, and we don't control them, and we don't control the conditioning that life delivers moment after moment that continues to act on that genetic structure and change us moment after moment after moment. So there's the illusion. There's the divine hypnosis. The divine hypnosis is that we believe that we are a separate, independent entity in control, needing pleasure, pleasure, pleasure in order to be complete. And the reality is we can rest in our being and feel complete in this moment, even when life is painful, which shows us, no, you don't need pleasure, pleasure, pleasure in order to be complete. That is an illusion. That is a psychological overlay that is creating suffering. It's creating a search for things to be a certain way in the future. And the psychological belief that I am in control of what I think and how I act, that too is an illusion. Because when we look at it a different way, we see that the functioning just happens according to our makeup that we don't control. And so when that falls away, and as the end of that, then there's the end of suffering, and we get to continue to live as a person, as a human being. So the word person and human being are the same. We are the human being, we are the person, but we are not a human being or a person as a separate doer, which is what we imagine ourselves to be. We're a person or a human being which is essentially an expression of life that is always functioning exactly according to life. So then we can forget about needing to relate to life as unreal, life as illusory. That actually isn't the integration, because in practice, in practical terms, it doesn't present as unreal. And so if we keep going around saying it's unreal, at some point we'll realize that doesn't match with the practical expression of life. So we stop saying it. It becomes an irrelevance, and it becomes seen as part of the process, but not an important part of what ultimately is deliverable, which is to live as the human being at peace, regardless of how life unfolds. So this is why I say it's perfectly fine for Anil to experience life from the perspective that there is an experiencer I say that's how life is designed to be experienced. Hopefully, the belief in doership in that experience, or in Anil, whichever way we want to look at it, gets weakened, dissolves, and then Anil, who's living his life as the experiencer, realizes that the experience is more or less the same as it was before, except that load of guilt and blame that was coloring and flavoring the experience with a sense of uncomfortableness is no longer there. That's, to me, that's the point. Yes.
Roger. I have two questions. The first one being more fundamental. I wanted to understand the difference between prescription and description that we use.
Yes.
I wasn't too clear about that.
So, if I gave a prescription to someone, if like I said, well, what you need to do is stop the thinking mind, right? That is essentially telling the person that they can stop the thinking mind. Now, that's not how I see it at all. The way I see it is that the person has their genes and up-to-date conditioning, which essentially forces the thinking mind and the working mind, the whole entity, to function exactly one way in each moment, the way it's designed to function. So if I tell someone, you need to stop the thinking mind, you need to stop thinking about blame and guilt and all of that, essentially I'm giving an instruction to a machine that the machine, unless it is programmed a particular way, is incapable of functioning. Right? So if I were to give prescriptions, it would be an indication that the core concept is either just made up or I don't understand it. The core concept that in each moment we will only be able to function the way that we're designed by life to function. So I'm definitely, and if you listen to the wordings, especially after I explain the next part, I'm very specific with the wordings. The wording can be heard by the doer. The way the wordings are put forward, they can be heard by the doer as prescriptions. Whereas actually they are descriptions of something. Like, for example, peace of mind is the ending or the dissolving of the thinking mind. The thinking mind, in practical term, manifests as guilt and blame, let's say. There's more, but let's just use those two, as guilt and blame. What you're really looking for is the end of guilt and blame. What you're looking for is the end of suffering, peace of mind. So if you listen to what I've said, you rewind the video, if you go back and look at the video, any of the videos, you'll see what I'm saying is just descriptions. Peace of mind is the end of suffering. Suffering arises in the form of guilt and blame. What you're really looking for is peace of mind, the end of guilt and blame. The doer inside of us can hear it and say, oh, Roger's telling me that I have to stop blaming and feeling guilt. Right? That will automatically happen. But in the words that I've put forward, I haven't actually been addressing a doer, telling them to do anything. So what I'm saying, whatever is said is never a prescription, always a description. Right? But why are the descriptions put forward if they're just descriptions? Someone would say, well, that's pointless. What's the point of just describing everything? But when we understand the mechanics of life as described in the teachings, it says the human being is essentially a biological instrument, a result of one's genes and up-to-date conditioning, and life is continually delivering new conditioning. And the new conditioning can alter or change our up-to-date conditioning. Because what is our up-to-date conditioning? Our up-to-date conditioning is the cumulative effect of all of the new conditioning that was delivered moment after moment after moment from the time we were conceived. So the human beings are a result of their genes and up-to-date conditioning. The up-to-date conditioning is a cumulative effect of the new conditioning delivered in each moment. And life is continually delivering new conditioning and continually changing our up-to-date conditioning. So the descriptions are information, basically new conditioning, being put out by one body-mind organism that has been designed by life, its genes and up-to-date conditioning in this moment, to be saying exactly this, as a response to the question that came out of another body-mind organism designed by life in that moment to ask that question. And the answer, which is always a description of what might happen, or a description of life and not a prescription of something for you to do, is new conditioning that can change your up-to-date conditioning. And then here's the grace of it all. If your up-to-date conditioning is changed in a particular way, what you'll find is the functioning of that body-mind organism obviously changes, because the functioning is a result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning. And if the up-to-date conditioning has been changed radically, then the functioning is going to change radically. And so that's why I say everything that is spoken about here is spoken about because it's completely relevant to only one topic, the topic of happiness in daily living. So when the descriptions are put out, the descriptions are being given to the working mind. And the working mind is essentially part of the up-to-date conditioning. Well, a combination of the genes and up-to-date conditioning. So when the descriptions are given to the working mind, I understand that that has the potential to change the functioning of the other human being. But how the new conditioning is received is not in my control and not in your control. So hopefully it gets received in a way that brings about positive change.
Okay, so when someone like me sits in a satsang like this, and I'm getting this description, I'm hearing out, I'm able to understand what it is, so it is landing in me. So do I understand, therefore, can I surmise that the grace is already happening?
Precisely.
Yeah.
You have no homework to do when you leave here. You don't have to make any effort. You just need to step out the door and take one step after the next, which is a result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning. And the changes will have either happened or not happened.
Right.
And the changes can be progressive, because what can happen is something could have changed, i.e. the working mind receives the new conditioning that says the flow of life is always pleasure or pain, which once again is just a description. The working mind receives that. You have no homework to do. You step out of the door. You stub your toe. Pain is felt. And then the thought arises, that's pain in the moment. And you didn't create that thought.
Right.
It was an output of the new conditioning, or the up-to-date conditioning that includes the new conditioning. And that thought and that observation becomes new conditioning that affects your up-to-date conditioning, which is how the understanding goes deeper and deeper and deeper, based on an investigation of your own, based on your own daily life experience. So now look at this wording, based on an investigation of your own, from your own life experience. So it sounds like, once again, there must be a prescription. The prescription is to investigate, an investigation of your own. But as we've seen, the investigation happens automatically once there is an interest, and even the interest is generated by the makeup of the person. Some people have no interest in this; they wouldn't even turn up. Once the interest is there and the working mind is equipped, life happens. You stub your toe, that's life happening, not your doing, it just happened. And then the investigation happens. So we can see it's a description of what might happen, not a prescription of something to do. So when I say, and based on an investigation of your own, a description of what might happen, investigating happened. You didn't do it.
Somewhere linking the same thing, Roger, to the second question I had, and that was about parenting.
Oh, yes.
Yesterday I was talking to you about it. So it so happens, I perhaps am referring more specifically to the kind of parenting I'm used to, the Indian culture. Mm-hmm. So there are, all the 5 to 6 forms of suffering that you talk about get heavily involved in the whole process. There are a lot of expectations, teenage children, and then the broad environmental changes that happen are happening so fast, apparently, that certain things we thought in the culture that these things are more likely to lessen the suffering in these peoples, maybe a spiritual conditioning, maybe being part of some satsangs, say bhajans, attending bhajans or whatever, which have been handed down to us through the culture. Obviously not taken up by the children because they're seen in a very different light. Suddenly in India, there's a lot of globalization, a lot of exposure to a lot of things and all that. So things have been changing very fast. So in this context, the balancing out between the love and the law, if I can put it like that, to balance out the love and the law in parenting becomes a constant challenge for any parent. That's my feeling. So I would like to really hear out to anything that from the concept that you give, anything that relates to parenting, I'd be pretty happy to hear out.
Yeah. So some of the significant parts of the framework to keep in mind when we talk about this is, one, let's say, everything is predetermined, or life is a creation. And you and I and your kids aren't the ones creating it. It's going to unfold the way it's destined to unfold. Another important part of the framework is that the flow of life is always either pleasure or pain. Nothing more than that. The flow of life is circumstance. And circumstance is either pleasure or pain. Our suffering is always attitudinal to circumstance, and not the circumstance itself. So the flow of life, always either pleasure or pain. That means that what you do, how you function as a parent, is effectively either pleasurable or painful to your children, and how your children function, which is also part of the flow of life, part of circumstance, is either pleasurable or painful to you. Another key component is that once you have done whatever you think or feel to do in the moment, which you can call the feeling of free will, which is actually the mechanism by which the story of life unfolds. Whenever you've done whatever you think or feel to do in the moment, understand that that action was a happening as part of the creation, and the outcome is going to be as it's going to be, and it's not in your control. So do what you can, do what you think you should or feel to do, knowing that the outcome is not in your control. So when we come to look, that's the framework. And so to me, the beauty of the framework is that it's general. And once someone has the framework in their mind, the deepening of the understanding is where the framework starts being applied, and where the investigation happens, such that the framework reveals your own situation and allows you to see it in these terms. But now not on a generic level, but on a very specific level. So when your child shouts at you and then goes into their room and slams the door, that's circumstance. And according to your preferences, which are part of your biological makeup, that behavior is not going to be pleasurable. So that means that's pain in the moment. So then you're seeing the framework expose, or the framework is coming down to the level of your own experience. And now you start to be able to see the landscape in a way that, well, let's call it accurate. So what's another very important part of the framework? It says your happiness, which is what you're really looking for. And if we lose sight of the fact we're really looking for this and think we're looking for something else, then what we're really looking for gets obscured. So the concept is your happiness, what you're really looking for, is happiness through peace of mind, not some happiness through pleasure, 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 pleasure. So if we understand whatever your children do in each moment, however they function, is either pleasure or pain to you. Your happiness is not dependent on pleasure or pain. Your happiness is happiness through peace of mind, which means a particular attitude to the circumstance. So, what's the attitude to the circumstance that leads to peace of mind? The attitude is the attitude of seeing life as a happening, seeing life as a creation, a story, you could say predetermined, if that helps. Meaning, just like a 300-page novel, when you're on page 70, the novel unfolds exactly as it's been written on page 70. It has to. And so life, you could look at like that, a creation that is always unfolding exactly as it's destined to unfold. So your child functions a particular way and creates pain in the moment to you. You then function a particular way according to your makeup, just like your child was. And the makeup was put in place as part of the story of life. So their behavior in that moment is part of the predetermined story of life. Your behavior as a response or a reaction to their behavior is part of the predetermined story of life. So the pain that you get delivered by the actions of your children and the pleasure that you get from the actions of is all part of the flow of life, your destiny, your karma. And the way you function is their destiny and their karma as part of the story of life. If you're looking for your happiness, the trick is when your attitude to the way they function and the way you function is one of witnessing it as a happening, rather than getting involved with it because you believe it's your doing and their doing and it should have been different. So this doesn't mean that in the moment, if they shout at you, you don't shout back. The shouting back can be a biological reaction. And hopefully, if the attitude of non-doership is in place, instead of the circumstance being dragged in horizontal time for 3 hours or 2 days where you then don't speak to each other, and it gets cut off after the event. And the beauty is once it's cut off and you see that your reaction was maybe not ideal, right? So you don't judge it as flawed such that you judge yourself as flawed, but you can discern it and say, well, that's not ideal. I don't want to shout at my children, but I did. So even if you don't want to, you did. And the non-doership won't turn it into guilt and shame. But the discernment without the guilt and shame means you can easily apologize to your child. Even if you see that the shouting came because of a behavior that also was not ideal. And you don't even need to insist on them apologizing. And if an apology from you doesn't happen, then you can see it in the same light. If suffering on your side happens, and it does get dragged out in horizontal time, then the understanding of non-doership, that obviously hasn't penetrated deep enough to prevent the suffering in horizontal time from happening, the attitude on an outer level will witness the suffering also as a happening, as part of the predetermined story of life, part of the creation. Because the creation we can describe on two levels. One is the flow of life, circumstance, but the creation also includes our attitude to the circumstance. And so if we are suffering, that's also there because it's not our doing.
Just one thought that came as you were talking, Roger. Do you think somebody can be influenced towards satsang?
Sure, that you could insist that they come to satsang or they get no pocket money, for example. And that would be an effective influence. But I wouldn't recommend that that's what you do. I would make it available, but leave it up to them to make the decision. In fact, if we look at parenting and how these concepts can be brought into parenting, I would say the most effective way, in fact, the only way really these concepts can come into the relationship is if the parent starts to have a deep understanding for themselves. Right? Otherwise, because it has to be something lived, and the relationship with the other needs to be a genuine, natural flow. And if the understanding is there, there'll be harmony in the relationship. Harmony doesn't mean you don't dislike someone, for example. You can actually, I think it's perfectly understandable to dislike your kids. Right? If they exhibit enough characteristics because of the environment they're growing up in or whatever, it's a complex thing, that of rudeness, for example, of any sort of things, the hairstyles that they have or whatever, it makes sense to not like certain things. To hate someone is a different thing, because the hatred of someone is based on seeing them as an enemy and a competitor, which means taking the pain that they deliver as an attack on who you are. And it requires you to see them as a separate doer in order to hate someone. And hate is a strong word, but even blame and resentment are forms of suffering and forms of hate, actually, in different degrees. So it's possible to dislike your children but not hate them with the understanding. Without the understanding, it's very possible to dislike your children and harbor a resentment for them. And obviously, in this conversation, we're only focusing on the negative, because in a child-parent relationship, like anything in life, there's the duality where there is the pleasure as well. So one of the things that I think would come through when the parent has an understanding is that they don't try to make the child like them, because they understand that actually the child has their own life to live, and often we're trying to make the child like the parent, because that's a form of pleasure for the parent, and sort of trying to gain pleasure by controlling someone is an indication of a fairly strong attachment to pleasure.
I think one of the thought that comes up to just take the advocacy on the parent side. One of the thought that comes up is that children at some stage, of course, they're adults and then they have their own thoughts, but you do feel that certain ways of being would actually lead them to a level of suffering, and then would take a long time, because you have seen that maybe.
Sure.
And you see yourself as a guide, mentor at least, and then you have to tell. So these are the things that can actually cause you that an expectation comes up along with the attachment.
Yeah. So the expectation is that you want the outcome to be a certain way, right? So what I suggest is a parent does have a responsibility to a child, but to a certain point, the responsibility doesn't extend to being in control of the outcome. No human is in control of the outcome. The responsibility essentially is for you to function the best that you can, which we're all doing in any moment, actually. So if you give descriptions to a child instead of prescriptions, then I think that's a beautiful way of saying it, where you're not telling them to be a certain way. You're saying, look, let me just describe life as I've come to see it based on my experience. And then you say, do what you will with it. But I have a responsibility to describe this to you. And I respect that you will then do whatever you will. And I don't need you to turn out a certain way. So that to me is a very deep form of love, where we don't insist on someone being different from who they are.
Wonderful, actually. I mean, looking at this teaching, I see it as just an unraveling happening through various contexts. Like parenting was just one context.
Yeah.
Wonderful hearing from you. Thanks so much, Raja.
Thank you for the question.
I might have some other questions, but I would not want to hijack now.
Well, let's see. I have about another 12 minutes. So.
Roger, this is a little silly question and also a contradiction in itself. But I have normally found that whenever I ask a question in a satsang, that's the time I am least able to hear the answer. Normally when I'm just sitting, I'm able to hear every word much more clearly than when it's spoken directly to me. And then it seems like there is a haze in front of me, and I'm hearing it through in the haze.
Right.
And that also seems like a suffering every time. So I wonder what it is, and if there is a way of seeing through this, and or is that too much expectation to hear every word of what is being said? And
well, the reality is that it's going to happen the way it happens. So if, for example, someone is nervous, and so they ask the question, and then the nerves of asking the question are still reverberating through the system, then the answer might not be received. Were you able to hear my answer?
thankfully, yes.
Huh? The good news is it's recorded, so you can go back and listen to the answer again. I'm not I'm not sure what that phenomena is really caused by, but it could be something simple like nerves.
Thank you.
Well, in relation to that, I think a phenomenon sometimes, I don't know if you agree with that, which can happen is, like, it happens for me when I go home. I don't actually remember the content of, to be very honest, most of what you said. But to me, it's not that relevant in a sense because the piece is felt, and in a sense, I mean, it's not a lot of going to memory and recalling what you have said or what this and that. But maybe it's, it doesn't actually matter if so much is remembered.
I think you're spot on. Sometimes we get worried about the fact that maybe we fell asleep or whatever, and I feel that in satsang something deeper is happening. And Ramesh often used to say, and I completely agree, at some point actually just dropping out of working hard to listen and to follow and just dropping into a relaxed place can be even more effective because you're opening the system up. And the truth of the matter is that the biological intelligence of the body is much, much broader than we can give it credit for. Because we only understand the part of the biological intelligence that seems like the bit that I know of. But the body is picking up so much in the environment and functioning according to that. And so, yeah, I agree that there's a lot happening on many levels. And this biological intelligence is a big part of what makes life happen so efficiently, so much so that we then maybe even relate to it as proof of life being more mystical or understandable than maybe it needs to be referred to. So let's be clear, life is mystical and mysterious and not understandable. But there are certain things that we can see and they can explain certain things. And if we appreciate the complexity of the biological intelligence of the body, it can explain a lot of things that happen that seem to be out of our capacity to reconcile. They can explain a lot of things that happen when the thinking mind falls away. Because when the thinking mind falls away, the intelligence of the body really gets to function fully. The thinking mind is always saying, this is what you should do and what you shouldn't do. And it's a very limited set of instructions based on a very limited and actually false belief, because the shoulds and shouldn'ts are really there to try and get maximum pleasure. That's their intention. It's essentially a strategy that we've put in place of how we should and shouldn't act in life in order to get as much pleasure, because we think pleasure is what is going to complete us. And so once those shoulds and shouldn't start falling away, and we just say, I'm just going to let life flow, what kicks in is the biological intelligence that isn't being cut off by the thinking mind that says, this is how I'm going to do it. So the thinking mind falls away, and then this biological intelligence flows as part of the flow of life. You don't need to do the biological intelligence, which is why life tends to become much more efficient, tends to become much more seemingly synchronistic, but I believe it's part of the biological intelligence moving us in a way that brings about outcomes, or not brings about, but moves in a way that is linked to circumstance that is very different to how it is when the thinking mind is driving the ship. Yeah. So listen with your heart is fine.
This about reincarnation, the karma, law of karma. You know that the question comes up once in a while, Roger, because on one level I can understand that if it's all universal consciousness, in which it could look like there's a Roger's consciousness and Shiva's consciousness, apparently working like that, then there need not be any explanation that this genetic conditioning of Shiva's consciousness should have come from something before. Because siblings born to the same mother, subject to the same genes perhaps, or same environmental condition almost, are very different. Mm-hmm. So this can be, we normally attribute to something called the previous Janma and Janma Parampara. In fact, there's a mention in Gita of Lord Krishna telling Arjuna that both of us have gone through many Janmas. Mm-hmm. I remember them, you do not. So this is a particular statement that's there. Mm-hmm. It's a little confusing on how these things get wedded on to concepts like yours.
Yes, there is a reconciliation that we can go through. But let's all, okay, so genes and up-to-date conditioning, or genes and conditioning. The genes of two identical twins are, for all intents and purposes, completely different, right? So the fact that it comes from the same mother, when it comes down to the fine details, they're completely different. So that's important to know. And then similarly, the twins, even though they're in the same house, the relationship to the mother from one of the twins could be different to the relationship to the mother of the other of the twins. And the same with the father, and then they go off and one plays tennis and the other one plays cricket. And so already all that was needed was the genes to be different, which they are. But on top of that, the conditioning, which seems on a curve, just like it seems like the genes are the same, and then it seems like the conditioning is the same. Actually, they, with the slightest of differences, they can diverge very dramatically. So that's important to keep in mind. If we say that this is a spontaneous arising in the mind of God, and that actually there's cause and effect isn't the reason for things, because if we look at a night dream at night and suddenly a dream pops into existence and the main character is 45 years old, they just came into existence out of nothing, and they might have a memory in the dream that says, they went to St. Mary's primary school. But there was no history, there was no past in the dream that just came into existence. So if this is a dream, essentially, on the one hand, you could say everything is brand new in each moment, and there is no cause and effect. However, when you look at this dream, just like a night dream, it is a dream that is designed to include cause and effect as an intrinsic part of the dream. So whenever something is present, there will be a causal explanation for it in the dream. And if we just look at it from the one angle and say it's spontaneously arising, so there is no cause, we're only looking at half of the picture. And this is often what happens when we go from believing only in cause and effect to then looking at life in a different context, in a different model, and we see that it's only a spontaneous arising in consciousness and cause and effect is illusory. That's a mistake again. It's an awakening to a new way of seeing it, but now that needs to be integrated. The cause and effect is impeccably always present in this manifestation. So an example of this is someone will say thoughts don't come from a brain, using the model of a spontaneous arising model. Thoughts are independent from the brain, they just arise as an object in the consciousness. And as I said, from a certain perspective, we can understand that logic, we can understand that explanation. But when we look at the manifestation, and if a neurosurgeon drills a hole in the skull and pokes the brain in a particular way that they know, where to poke it, there is a direct correlation to things like thoughts and movements of the body. So on the same basis, if someone's looking at this as a spontaneous creation, let's say the movement has nothing to do with a brain, for example. thoughts have nothing to do with the brain. There is no brain. Where's the brain? Find the brain. Right? And if we do that experiment, that exercise where you're present with the experience as it presents now, yeah, you have to agree there is no brain. I can't assume that thoughts are coming from a brain because I can't experience the brain in this moment, but there can be an experience of thought in this moment. So that investigation says don't make these assumptions that thoughts come from a brain. Don't make any assumptions of causality. It's not verifiable if you're really present with the present moment. That's a controlled exercise, in a sense, where the brain is, or attention is being directed to see the moment a particular way. And we can, sometimes when we do these, we can think that's life, but it's not necessarily life in its completeness. It's life experienced when we're directing the faculties of the brain a particular way. In another moment, the brain surgeon comes in and says, this won't hurt a bit, saws off the skull, right? And there's the brain. Now you can experience the brain, right? It's there. So when brain surgery is there, there is a brain. And when they put the sensors on the skull and they ask you to think about something, or they show you a gruesome picture, suddenly certain parts of the brain light up and there's a direct correlation, which indicates a causal link. And then the surgeon can, if they cut the link between the left and right hemispheres, certain effects happen. Now, we can't relate to any of these things as absolute because we can't know anything absolutely, but we can't ignore what's presenting in front of us either and not hold it as absolute, but say, well, I can also see that this story is a story of cause and effect. And so when, was it Lord Krishna says, we have all experienced past lives, it's really saying that this spontaneous story of life created in the consciousness of God, by God, if we take that model, which is the model that I guess you're referring to, right? Because it's the model of Krishna would be the one closer to Advaita.
Yes. Generally what we expect of the Gita is rest of the thing is all about the jnana.
Mm-hmm.
But there is this particular stanza where he is saying that you and I have both of us have taken many births.
Yes.
It's just that I remember all of them, but you do not.
Yeah. So what the implication is there is that he is the way he is, and the other character is the way they are as a result of the evolution that has happened before. So it implies a past and it implies causality. And I don't see any problem with that as long if we say, well, it is a creation, it is a story, but the story is a story of time. So that means that the first birth was included, the second birth was included, and all of the events in the first birth were included in the story. The carryover of the unresolved desires and fears, that is the movement of the vasanas and samskaras from one birth to the next birth. Different to the notion of a transmigrating soul, right? This is a notion of a transmigrating bunch of vasanas and samskaras, tendencies, data, not necessarily a soul. But in the story, it is one birth is linked to another birth, and what happened here, some of it is resolved, some is unresolved, and what's unresolved goes to this one. And then stuff gets added in the second birth, some gets resolved, what's left over goes to the third and the fourth. So Krishna is saying, I remember all of my past lives. So I understand why I am the way I am. And it's impersonal, because I see that the first birth was destined, and everything that happened in the first birth was destined. So none of it is personal. So in this story of cause and effect, you could say that the law of karma is included as one of the rules of the story, but it's really impersonal, meaning that the first birth is destined to function in a way that, according to the law of karma, will receive certain consequences. Right? But that's not a separate independent entity functioning and then getting punished or getting rewarded, but rather an entity that is destined to function a certain way according to the story. And then, because the laws of karma are part of the story, the consequence has to be a certain way in the story according to the laws of karma. And so then we can say, oh, there are laws of karma. They are what dictate how the story unfolds, but they're very complex and we'll never know what they are, for starters. But we can say, okay, that's how life unfolds. What's really important is to say it's not personal karma. It's karma happening, which means cause and effect happening.